Good afternoon. Glad to see so many people made it back from lunch. So I'm going to talk today in really high-level terms about app analytics and data, and I'm going to cover three main themes. I'm going to talk a bit about what data you can be tracking, how you actually track those data, and finally, what you can do with them, why you want to track them in the first place. So just to get started, a bit about myself. Let's see. Am I using the right? Nope, went too far. There we go. Spoilers. So a bit about myself. I'm the CMO of 23 Snaps, which is a private social network for families. We have over 500,000 users in 179 countries, and we attribute a large part of our growth to how we've been able to understand our data and our users and leverage that to grow our user base overall. And just to point out, I'm not associated with any of the services that I might talk about today. They're all things that I have either used myself or have evaluated for use in our company, but none of them are any recommendations other than my own opinion, nor am I associated with them. So to kick off, let's see. Just with looking at what you actually track. So what is it that you want to be looking at when you plan your data implementation strategy? And what I've noticed is that with most companies, I'd say there's 4 levels of understanding you can have about your app and your company's data. And the further you go down those 4 levels, the deeper your understanding equates very closely to how sophisticated your level of data tracking as a company is. So to look more deeply at those 4 levels, first thing, almost every company has it. You're kind of in trouble if you don't, is number of downloads. Very easy, you get it directly from the App Store. The second thing, sort of the next level down, you have to understand your number of downloads to understand how many of those downloads result in a session activated or a registration with your app. And again, most companies have this information. The next level down, how many of those users who register or start a session complete a KPI, actually achieve some event that is relevant to your business. And then finally, the deepest level of understanding, the thing that is sort of the holy grail of why you're collecting data in the first place, is to look at what those users who complete KPIs have in common with each other, and more importantly, what makes them different from people who don't. So that's kind of what we're aiming for here. That's why what we're using as a framework when deciding what data to track is how to get to that core of what makes our super users unique. And a quick note about vanity metrics. Vanity metrics are information that may not actually help you understand your business, but look great on paper. So it obviously depends on the company you're in, whether some of these are more or less relevant, but things like page views within the app, maybe number of App Store reviews, they don't necessarily help you get to that core of what makes your super users the most unique for most companies. So to get a little bit more specific, what are you actually tracking to understand and move down this funnel? Those first two levels really correspond to your user acquisition. So here you want to be trying to understand and find tools that help you learn the channel that users are using to find your app, the demographics as much as possible, the gender, the location, the age of your users, and also the cost. This is an obvious one to help you understand your overall business metrics. But at this level, you're looking for information and tracking tools that help you gain this sort of knowledge about your users. The next 2 levels correspond to user engagement. And here you want to be looking to understand and track things like the events that people are completing in your app, the retention, how long are they sticking around, and the virality, how many people are they telling about your app or sharing your app with. And then also those last 2 levels correspond to your revenue numbers. You also want to be looking at the demographics of who's spending money in your app and how much revenue overall, the lifetime value. So these are some different metrics, and obviously this is different for every company. But the aim here is to get to that bottom core bit of knowledge, what makes your most valuable users unique and different from the ones who are not as valuable to you. So, as I said, every company has slightly different tracking needs, and I hope that idea of moving down through each level will help you think about what data you can be tracking in your own company. But how do you actually track that data? And more importantly, how do you implement tracking solutions within your own company? So I'd say overall, there's probably 3 different categories of tracking solutions. The first I'll refer to as startup solutions, although they're certainly valuable to companies of every size. And I call them startup solutions because for the most part, they are free. Free or very low cost, or they have a free service associated with them. And that is really the strongest pro here. It's great that there are so many fantastic analysis tools that are freely available for companies of all sizes. Another thing that's great about these solutions is that because so many people use them, they can also offer industry benchmarking. So the likes of Google and Flurry will allow you to see how you stack up to other competitors in your industry. Also, because so many people use them, there's a lot of literature online, a lot of people who've written about how to get the most out of these different services. Some of the downsides are that they tend not to be as robust or offer as detailed analytics as some of the paid solutions. So often they don't have custom event tracking. You can't tell it specifically what to track within your app. They very rarely connect to any sort of push marketing channels, so you can't market to segments of your user base. And they also very rarely have click attribution. So it's harder for you to see where people were before they came to the App Store and then downloaded your app. And obviously this varies across every platform. So some of them may have one but not another. But on the whole, the free services are going to be a little bit less robust than the paid ones. One thing that's both a pro and a con here is that most of the free services are associated in some way with an advertising network. And this is great because actually what this means is if you use that advertising network, you do get a click attribution from that source. But the downside is that you'll never have as powerful an analytics tool from a company whose core revenue model isn't based on selling that analytics tool. So that leads nicely into the alternative, which are the enterprise solutions. And these include things like Mixpanel and Localytics, among many others, some of whom are here today. And what's great about these is the level of insight and analysis that they do for you. They'll give you advanced statistics tools like cohort analyses. They support push marketing, so if you want to send out an email or a push notification to segments of your database, that's often an option as well. And if it's relevant to your business, they support an API export. They also are very good cross-platform, particularly between web and mobile. So if you want to track a user who is using your website and look at how they perform on your mobile app, then these can be great solutions as well. The biggest downside is the cost. Oftentimes these are completely prohibitively expensive for small and independent developers. They also require a lot of dev time to set up properly, which I'll speak more about in a moment. And if you think the upfront cost is high, that's nothing to how they scale, as we realized as we grew our user base. So they certainly are pricey. One thing that's, again, both a pro and a con is that they really actually are a full-time job to maintain and mine the data in these services. And that's great if you have the resources in-house to take advantage of them. But if you don't have that, you can often feel pressure to spend more time in the service and like you're underusing a very expensive solution in your company. So the last category here, custom dashboards. So if you have the resource and the knowledge in-house, you can build completely custom dashboards to look at the data that are relevant for your company. But even if you don't want to build custom dashboards yourself by pulling in your server logs and your information to build it yourself, there are great tools out there like Duxboard and Geckoboard, which plug into third-party service providers, everything from New Relic to Pivotal Tracker to Google Analytics, and will allow you to drag and drop data from other sources to make a dashboard that's really relevant to you or your company. The pros of this are obviously it's as specific and as relevant as you want it to be, but the downside is that the only thing you're going to get is what you're able to build. And that may sound obvious, but in practice what that means is if you don't have a statistics background, you may never end up building tools like a cohort analysis or other advanced tracking and analytics tools that come as standard with paid services. So there are a number of solutions out there, and spoiler alert, this is the key, this is the takeaway from my talk. The biggest point that I cannot stress enough is the decision of which tool to use should not be made by the business executives alone. This is a decision that should be made with your development team. So bring in the CTO, bring in the head of development, because implementing these services is only the first step. The next and much longer step is actually optimizing these services. So at 23 Snaps, we spent over 8 weeks and completely wiped our data library twice before we figured out the best way to track events across users and platforms. Once you've optimized that integration, there's still the maintenance of that. If you update your app, if you start tracking new events, if they update their API, somebody needs to be responsible for maintaining that connection. And then finally, if exporting that data is relevant to your business, you need someone who's able and available to do that. So making sure that you're involving the developers throughout the process of deciding which service to implement will actually save you a lot of time farther down as they're learning about how to use this system as well. So one of the other issues that I've noticed both in the implementation stage and further on with these analytics tools is the difficulty that marketing and other non-technical roles have communicating their tracking needs to developers. So there are many ways for services to send and receive and display data, and if you aren't able to communicate why you want certain bits of information, you may end up with data that's completely useless from a marketing standpoint. So to solve that problem, when I talk to our developers about what data we want to be collecting, I try to use the who, what, when, where, why chart. So who is going to be accessing and using this data? What are we going to track, and when does it need to be accessible? Is it a real-time report? Is it daily or weekly updates? Where will it be stored? Is it on a third-party service or something we need access to in-house? And finally, most importantly, why do I want this? What is it I want to do with these data? And if you can answer as many of these questions as possible, it will really help developers understand how to implement what are implemented across a number of different options that they will have available. So another example from 23 Snaps, I went and asked our developers to start tracking the number of friends that someone had in the 23 Snap service. This was data we hadn't had before, and I wanted to know how many people had friends on the service and how many did they have. The developers went and started tracking that in a custom dashboard. I was frustrated because what I'd wanted to do was email the people with no friends and encourage them to connect on the service. And I didn't actually explain that to the development team. So the output that I got may have answered my question, but it wasn't actually useful in terms of my marketing efforts. So to answer that final question, the why, I'm going to move on to sort of the last theme here, which is why are you actually tracking this information? Why are you capturing data? And going back to the idea of that core level, the deepest level of understanding you can have about what makes your super users unique, if you can get to that point, this is what you want to be doing with that data afterwards. So the first thing you can do is market to your existing users. If you understand what your most valuable users look like, you can go to your existing user base and target them with email messages, push marketing, in-app messages to try to get them to look more like that core user base. How do you get them to either match the demographics or the steps taken within the app of your most active users? The next option is to attract more users who look like your most active ones. So depending on how much information you have, you can go to a very specific media network that may have access to users that match your best acting profile. You could also go to your best existing users and encourage them to invite their friends under the assumption that they share similar interests. So the more you understand about what makes your super users unique, the better. A good place for most companies to start with this is to understand the channels that drive the most downloads. But they need to be aware of whether or not the channels that drive the most downloads actually drive the most engaged users, which is why an understanding of what makes your super users unique is very important when looking at acquiring new ones. And finally, the last option here is to use it to improve the product. So both free and paid marketing tools often have options to build funnels or something similar, so you can map a user's path through certain parts of your product. And once you've mapped out that path and analyzed the results, you can use that to influence design and copy changes that will hopefully lead more people to complete the funnel in the future. But a word of warning here as well, make sure that people who complete your funnel are actually more valuable users in your app. An example, again, from 23 Snaps was that we noticed our super users, best, most active ones, all had created a profile for their child, they'd uploaded some photos, and they connected to one other person in the app. But the completion rate for that particular funnel was quite low. So we built a new onboarding process to push people through each of those steps, and lo and behold, our funnel increased by 50%. There are 50% more people who are going through all three of those steps. So we said, great, it's a success, move on. About 8 weeks later, we noticed that the overall retention rate of our user base had gone down. We went back and looked and realized that people who had completed these steps that we thought were associated with our best users actually were less likely to stick around long term. And we hypothesized this was because we'd taken away their ability to explore the app. But the real takeaway there is that by optimizing a single part of your app, you may have unintended consequences elsewhere. So that's it from me. I hope that the idea of a funnel of information and trying to reach that core level of understanding of your users, also how to implement your data tracking solutions with your development team, and finally what to do with those data has been helpful, and have a great afternoon.